They said she'd never last a single winter. They said the richest rancher in the territory didn't need a real wife, you see. He needed a quiet woman who would stay out of his way and not ask difficult questions. But when the fever came and the snow buried every road out of Silver Creek, the woman this town had spent 2 months underestimating was the only thing standing between 67 people and a death nobody had prepared for. She arrived with no jewelry, no fine dresses, no grand expectations. She arrived with seeds, medical herbs, handwritten journals, and a mind that had been built deliberately, methodically, over a lifetime for exactly the kind of disaster nobody in this valley believed was coming. Wyatt Blackwood had money, land, cattle, and a name that commanded respect across 3 counties. What he didn't have was a plan for when none of that was enough. Clara Whitmore had the plan. This is the story of a woman who saw the danger before anyone else did, built the shelter before anyone else would, and held an entire valley together when the worst arrived. Not because she was fearless, not because everything went the way she intended, but because she had decided, long before she ever set foot in Silver Creek, that preparation was an act of love for people you hadn't met yet. Stay until the very end. This story will earn it. If it moves you, hit like, drop a comment with the city or country where you're watching from, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Every name in that comment section tells me how far this story has traveled. Let's begin. The stage rolled into Silver Creek on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, and half the town turned out to watch it. That was how things worked out here. Not because people were particularly welcoming, but because a stranger's arrival was the closest thing to entertainment most of them would see until the spring trading season. Men leaned against porch posts with their arms crossed. Women stood in clusters near the general store, pretending to talk about other things while their eyes tracked the coach as it lurched to a stop in front of Hadley's post. Inside the coach, Clara Whitmore pressed her hand flat against the window frame to brace herself as the wheels dropped into a rut and the whole vehicle shuddered. The man seated across from her, a traveling merchant who had talked without pause for the last 40 miles, gave her a sympathetic look. "Silver Creek," he announced, as if she hadn't read every map she could find before leaving home. "End of the line, miss." "I know," she said. She waited for the dust to settle before she stepped out. Not out of vanity, out of habit. Her mother had always said that the first moment people see you tells them everything they'll believe about you for the next 6 months. So you might as well take a breath and be deliberate about it. Clara was 26 years old. She was not tall, not striking in the way that made men stop talking mid-sentence. Her hair was dark and practical, pinned without fuss. Her coat was good wool but not fashionable. She wore the kind of boots that were made for working in, not for being seen in. When she stepped off the coach and onto the dirt of Silver Creek's main street, she looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had come from somewhere else and intended to stay. The town looked back at her with the particular expression of a place that had seen a dozen women arrive with hope and leave within a season, broken down by wind and isolation and the grinding weight of a life that offered very little softness. 2 trunks came off the coach behind her, handled roughly by the driver's assistant, a boy of about 16 who didn't bother asking if he should be careful. "Easy," Clara said, not sharply, just clearly. He looked at her, mildly surprised, and set the second trunk down with somewhat more care. She stood in the street and looked around. The town was smaller than she'd expected, which was saying something because she hadn't expected much. A main road of packed dirt, a livery stable at one end, a blacksmith beside it. 3 saloons that she could count, which seemed like too many for the size of the place. A church with a weathered steeple that needed paint. A general store. A doctor's office with a hand-lettered sign. A land office. A handful of other storefronts, some occupied, some clearly not. The buildings were functional. Most of them were still standing more out of stubbornness than good construction. She could see rot in a window frame from across the street. She noticed that the well in the center of town had a pulley system that someone had jury-rigged at least twice and would need replacing before spring. She noticed all of this the way some people notice weather, automatically, without deciding to. "Miss Whitmore?" The voice came from her right. She turned. The man standing at the edge of the boardwalk was not what she had imagined, and she had tried hard not to imagine anything. He was tall, genuinely tall. not the kind of tall that fades when a man isn't wearing his hat. Dark hair, worn a little long, going gray at the temples. A face that had spent years outdoors and showed it. Weathered, angular, with lines around the eyes that could have come from either squinting into the sun or grief, or most likely both. He was wearing a good coat and working man's boots, which told her something. He was watching her the same way she was watching the town, taking stock, making calculations. Wyatt Blackwood. She'd known the name before she'd agreed to come. Everyone in 3 counties knew the name. The man who'd built the largest cattle operation in the territory from a single lease, and a lot of years he refused to talk about. 41 years old, widower, no children living. That last part she knew too. "Mr. Blackwood," she said. He came off the boardwalk and walked toward her with a kind of economy of movement. No wasted steps, no performance for the audience, of which there were currently about 30 people doing a poor job of pretending not to watch. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her the way he'd probably look at a parcel of land he was considering purchasing, carefully, without committing himself. "You're younger than I expected," he said. It was not a compliment or a criticism. It was an observation. "You're older," she replied. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile. More like a door opening half an inch and then reconsidering. "Fair enough," he said. He glanced at her trunks. "Those yours?" "Both of them." He looked at them. Most women who arrived as potential wives brought trunks full of household goods, linens, personal effects. Her trunks were heavier than that. The boy who'd unloaded them had grunted under the weight. "What's in them?" Wyatt asked. "Tools," she said. "Seeds, medical supplies, books." "Books," he repeated. "Journals, mostly. My grandmother's. My mother's. Written records of what works and what doesn't." He didn't say anything to that. He just nodded once, slowly, and then signaled to a man standing near a wagon at the edge of the road. "Load them up, Hector." Hector was a compact man of about 45 with a dark mustache and the careful movements of someone who had been working the same land for many years. He hefted both trunks into the wagon bed without asking for help and without complaint, which told Clara he was either very strong or very accustomed to not making his labor visible. Wyatt gestured toward the wagon. "We've got about 3 hours of daylight." "Then we should go," Clara said, and climbed up before he could offer a hand. The Blackwood Ranch was not what she had imagined either, and in this case she'd done quite a bit of imagining. She had pictured something imposing, a grand house perhaps, or at least a well-ordered compound. She had pictured the kind of wealth that arranges itself in visible ways. What she found was something more complicated. The main house was large, but not ostentatious. 2 stories of good timber, a covered porch along the front, real glass in the windows. Behind it spread the operation itself. Barns, a bunkhouse, storage structures, paddocks, and beyond those the open range where she could see the distant movement of cattle, even in the low afternoon light. It was more than she'd been able to picture from description alone. The sheer scale of it, the sense of how much labor it represented, how many years of accumulation, settled into her like something heavy. But she also noticed immediately what wasn't there. No root cellar. At least not a proper one. There was a small dugout near the kitchen with a few barrels in it, but nothing that would hold the kind of stores a ranch this size would need if supply lines were cut. The wood piles were good, but not exceptional. The grain storage was in the barn, which was dry, but which shared walls with the livestock space. A risk in fire conditions that someone had either not thought about or decided not to bother with. She filed these things away and said nothing. There was a woman named Esther who managed the main house. She was perhaps 60, with an expression of permanent wariness and efficient hands. She showed Clara to a room on the 2nd floor, clean, well-made, a window that looked out over the southern range. Clara thanked her and meant it. Supper that first night was eaten at a long table in the main kitchen. Wyatt was there, and so were 3 of his senior ranch hands. A man named Dale, who was perhaps 50 and had the careful stillness of someone who'd been working for Wyatt a long time. A younger man named Cole, who had the restless energy of someone still trying to prove himself. And Hector, who had driven the wagon and now ate with the focused silence of a man who had learned that quiet was a form of self-preservation. Clara had been on ranches before, as a girl. She understood the social geometry of these meals, that the hired men ate here because Wyatt wanted to know what was happening in the bunkhouse without having to ask directly, and because it kept a certain kind of loyalty in place. She understood that they were watching her, and that they were doing the specific calculation of women who married into frontier operations. How much trouble, how long before she left, and whether her presence would improve or complicate their own working lives. She didn't perform for them. She ate. She answered questions when they were asked. She listened more than she spoke. At one point, Cole asked her, with a grin that was just a little too pointed to be friendly, "You ever actually worked a ranch before, Miss Whitmore? Or you just read about it in those books of yours?" "I grew up on a farm," she said. "Different kind of work, but the soil doesn't care what you call it. Farm's not the same as cattle country." "No," she agreed. "But a bad winter kills both the same." Dale set down his fork and looked at her for the first time with something other than polite neutrality. Wyatt, at the head of the table, said nothing, but he was watching. The first week passed in a kind of careful negotiation. Clara walked the property every morning. Not aimlessly. She had a method to it, working in sections, looking at what was there and what wasn't. She asked questions of the hands when she had specific reasons to, and she tried to ask them in a way that didn't embarrass anyone or imply she was cataloging their failings, because she wasn't. She was cataloging the ranches. She found what she expected to find. Blackwood's operation was excellent at what it did, which was raising and selling cattle. The animals were well fed and in good condition. The fencing was maintained. The hands knew their work. Wyatt ran a tight, professional outfit, but the ranch had been built entirely around the assumption that nothing would interrupt its normal functioning. There was no plan for a flood. There was no plan for a quarantine. There was no plan for a winter that shut the roads for 2 months instead of 2 weeks. The way the ranch was organized, it could sustain itself perfectly under normal conditions and collapse with startling speed under abnormal ones. Clara recognized this because she had grown up watching her mother map out exactly these kinds of vulnerabilities on every piece of land they'd ever lived on. Her mother had grown up watching her own mother do the same. It was a skill that had been passed down through women who'd had reason to think about disaster. Not because they were pessimists, but because they'd learned that the world periodically stopped cooperating, and the only sensible response was to be ready for it. On the 8th day, she asked Wyatt if they could talk. He was in the yard mending fence, which surprised her. She'd expected a man of his wealth to delegate that kind of work. He looked up when she approached, set down the pliers. "Something wrong with the house?" he asked. "The house is fine," she said. "I want to talk about the property." He waited. "You don't have adequate emergency storage," she said. He looked at her the way men in his position sometimes looked at suggestions they hadn't solicited, with the particular patience of someone deciding how irritated to be. "We have storage." "You have operational storage," Clara said. "Food for the week, grain for the season. Enough wood to get through a normal winter. What you don't have is a reserve. Something that functions specifically when the normal system breaks down. We've been fine for 12 years. "You've had 12 good years," she said. "That's not the same thing." He picked up the pliers again. "And I suppose you have a solution." "A root cellar. A real one, not the dugout by the kitchen. Something below the frost line, deep enough to maintain temperature through a hard winter. Big enough to hold several months of provisions. Not just food, but medicines, lamp oil, preserved seed, basic tools. The kind of thing that keeps 30 people alive if the roads close in December and don't open until March." Wyatt looked at her steadily. "That's a significant undertaking." "Yes." "And expensive." "Yes." "For a problem we haven't had." "For a problem we haven't had yet," Clara said. "There's a difference." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the yard carrying dust and the smell of cattle and wood smoke. Somewhere in the barn, a horse shifted and knocked against its stall. "How would you even know what to stock it with?" he said. It wasn't quite a dismissal. It was closer to skepticism asking to be answered. "I have a list," she said. "I've been working on it since I arrived." He looked at her. Really looked at her. Not the measuring glance he'd given her on the street in town, but something longer and less guarded. She had the feeling he was revising something in his mind, though she couldn't tell what. "Let me see the list," he said finally. She showed him the list that evening, spread across the kitchen table after Esther had cleared the supper things. It was 3 pages, dense with her careful handwriting. She had organized it into categories: food preservation, medical supplies, tools and materials, fuel, seed stock, and within each category she had noted quantities, storage requirements, and estimated shelf life. She had also, at the end, included estimated costs, which she'd calculated using the prices from Hadley's general store and adjusting for bulk. Wyatt read it in silence. He read it more carefully than she'd expected, going back to certain sections, asking a question once about the quantity of rendered fat she'd listed. For cooking, treating leather, and lamp fuel, she said, it serves 3 functions. And another question about the medical herbs. Some of these aren't things the doctor stocks, he said. No, she agreed. They're older remedies, but they work for things medicine doesn't reach yet. When he was done, he set the pages down and looked at the wall for a moment. You put estimated labor in here too, he said, for the digging. The hands could do it during the slower weeks in November if we started now. It would take about 3 weeks with 4 men. Dale won't like it, he said. He'll think it's make work. Dale doesn't have to like it, she said, and then caught herself. I mean, you don't need him to like it. You need him to do it. Wyatt almost smiled. First time I've heard you tell me what I need. I've been thinking it all week. This time he did smile, saw a small dry thing that came and went, but it was real. I imagine you have. He leaned back in his chair. He was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she'd pushed too far, said too much, miscalculated the pace at which this man could be approached. Then he said, All right, draw me up the dimensions and I'll have Cole start marking it out in the morning. Clara kept her expression even. I'll have it ready by breakfast, she said. The digging took 4 weeks, not 3. November had other ideas about the weather, delivering 2 early cold snaps that hardened the upper soil and slowed progress. Cole complained loudly. Dale complained quietly, which was somehow worse. Hector said nothing and worked steadily, which Clara had come to understand was his form of agreement. She worked alongside them. This surprised everyone, including Wyatt. He came out one afternoon to find her in the pit with a pickaxe, breaking up a clay shelf that was resisting the shovels, her coat off despite the cold, her hair escaping its pins in every direction. Miss Whitmore, he said from the edge of the excavation. She looked up. There was mud on her cheek. Mr. Blackwood. You don't need to be down there. The work needs to go faster, she said. I'm down here because the work needs to go faster. Cole, who was standing 6 feet away and had been doing a great deal less than he should have been, had the decency to look embarrassed and pick up his shovel again. Wyatt stood at the edge for another moment. Then he jumped down into the pit and took the pickaxe from her. Show me where the clay shelf runs, he said. She showed him. They worked until the light failed. By the end of November, the cellar was dug, framed, and lined. Clara had sourced the materials for the shelving herself, driving to the mill in Harmon's Crossing with Hector, and negotiating a price that made Hector blink with surprise. Where'd you learn to bargain like that? He asked on the drive back, the lumber stacked in the wagon behind them. My mother, she said. She said that a woman who can't negotiate is a woman who has to accept whatever she's given. She didn't believe in accepting things. Hector was quiet for a while, the wagon wheels rolling over the frozen road. Then he said, She sounds like a good woman. She was, Clara said. She also would have thought this cellar was too small, but we'll expand it in the spring. Hector laughed. A genuine thing, unexpected. You already planning the expansion? I'm always planning the expansion, Clara said. That's the job. The stocking of the cellar took 2 more weeks. Clara drove the purchasing herself, in cooperation with Wyatt, who released the funds with less resistance than she'd expected, whether because the list had convinced him or because the act of digging it himself had made it real to him. She wasn't sure. She brought in preserved meats, dried beans and grain, root vegetables packed in sand, salt in quantities that made Hadley at the general store raise an eyebrow. She brought in lamp oil, candles, 2 extra lanterns, coils of rope, good quality, basic carpentry tools, a set of medical supplies that she and the town doctor, a man named Nathaniel Cross argued about extensively. Dr. Cross was perhaps 50, precise and slightly formal in the way of men who had been educated somewhere better than where they'd ended up and hadn't quite made peace with the distance. He had a good mind. He also had the specific stubbornness of a man who believed that whatever he knew constituted the main body of what could be known. "You're stocking folk remedies," he said, when she showed him the medicinal portion of her list. "I'm stocking alternatives," she said. "Things that work when what you normally use isn't available. Willowbark tea and elderberry syrup aren't medicine. They're not surgery either," she said, "but they reduce fever and support recovery, and if we're cut off in a bad winter, recovery is what we're managing. Not the acute phase, the aftermath, when people are technically no longer sick but still weak enough to die from it." He looked at her for a long moment over the counter. "Where did you study?" "I didn't," she said. "I learned it from watching my mother keep people alive in situations where there wasn't a doctor." He made a sound that wasn't quite dismissive, but wasn't quite agreement. "I'm not asking you to endorse it," Clara said. "I'm asking you to think about what happens if there's an epidemic in January and you run out of quinine. What do you do then?" He didn't have a good answer to that. She had noticed that people often didn't when they were confronted not with a hypothetical future, but with the specific texture of what that future might look like. She stocked the herbs. December arrived with the cold that belonged to December in this part of the world. Not vicious yet, but purposeful. The cattle were moved. The barns were winterized. The hands settled into the slower rhythms of the cold season, the kind of work that sustained rather than built. Wyatt and Clara had reached a kind of working arrangement that was not quite friendship and not quite the formal distance of two strangers who'd agreed to share a house. They ate together most evenings. They talked about the ranch, and increasingly about other things. She told him about the part of the country she'd come from, the different way the land worked there, the flooding that came in spring and the strange, dry summers. He told her once, briefly, about the early years of building the ranch, the winters he'd spent in a structure that barely qualified as a cabin, the year the first herd made it through, and the year before that when nothing had. He didn't talk about his wife. She didn't ask. But she noticed things. The way he sometimes came in from the range and stood in the yard for a moment before coming inside, looking at nothing in particular. The way he would start to say something and then change it to something else, as if he'd been heading toward a word that hurt and had learned to navigate around it. The way he checked the bunkhouse twice on cold nights, not because the hands needed checking on, but because he needed to know they were there. He was a man who had built an entire life around making sure people survived. He had just built it around money and land because those were the tools he had trusted, and because trust was a thing that had to be rebuilt very slowly after loss broke it down. She understood that. She didn't say so. It was the second week of December when the first cases appeared. A boy from the Decker farm, 9 years old, the middle of 5 children, came down with fever on a Monday. His mother thought it was a cold. By Wednesday, 2 of his siblings had the same fever, and it had a quality to it that made the mother drive 3 miles through mud to the doctor's office. Dr. Cross saw them on Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, he had heard from 2 other families. By Friday, when he came out to the Blackwood Ranch to speak to Wyatt, he had heard from 7. Clara was in the yard when his buggy pulled in. She watched his face as he climbed down and knew before he spoke that it was not a routine call. "How bad?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment with the slightly startled expression he still occasionally wore when she anticipated him. "It's moving fast," he said. "I've seen this pattern before. It'll be through the whole valley inside 2 weeks." "What kind of fever?" He named it, a strain he'd seen in the Eastern Territories 5 years back, highly contagious, with a mortality rate that was significant among the very young and the very old. The acute phase was brutal. The recovery phase was long and treacherous. People who survived the fever itself frequently died in the weeks after from exhaustion and secondary complications. Clara stood in the yard with her hands in her coat pockets and looked at the cellar entrance, the heavy door she and Hector had built, the earthen ramp that led down to the shelved and organized interior. "We need to open it," she said. Wyatt, who had come out of the barn while they were talking, stopped beside her. "Open it? We need to tell people what we have in there," she said. "And we need to start thinking about how to use it." Cross looked between them. What's in there? Enough, Clara said, to keep the valley alive through this, if we're smart about it. Dr. Cross stayed for supper that night, though he barely ate. He sat at the far end of the table with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and the particular stillness of a man running numbers in his head that kept coming out wrong. Wyatt didn't eat much either. He cut his food into pieces and moved them around his plate and said very little, which Clara had come to understand was not indifference, but the opposite. He went quiet when something was working on him, the way a river goes quiet in the deep places. Esther refilled the coffee without being asked and disappeared back into the kitchen, and the three of them sat with the sound of wind finding the gaps in the window frames and the distant low of cattle somewhere in the dark. How many families in the valley? Clara asked Cross. 41, he said. Give or take. Some of the smaller homesteads out past Miller Creek, I don't always get accurate counts. People come and go. And you think 2 weeks before it's widespread. That's if it moves at the pace I saw in Harmon County 5 years back. It could be faster. The Decker children have 3 cousins in town. They were all at Sunday meeting together last week. He paused. Could have seeded half the valley already. Wyatt set down his fork. What do you need? Cross looked at him. I need about 3 times the medicine I have. I need people to stay home and stop visiting their sick neighbors without precautions. I need... He stopped, looked at his coffee cup. I need the roads to stay open. That's what I actually need. The roads to stay open so I can get resupply from Caldwell City. The wind pushed against the house. Somewhere, a shutter that hadn't been properly latched knocked once, twice, against its frame. Clara said, What's the forecast? Cross shook his head. Old Peter Voss says we've got 10 days, maybe 2 weeks before the real cold comes down. He's been reading weather in this valley for 30 years, and he's wrong maybe once a decade, so I tend to listen. 10 days. Clara looked at the window, at the darkness beyond it, at the cold that was pressing itself against the glass. Then we have 10 days to get ready, she said. She was at the cellar at first light. Hector found her there an hour later, the door propped open, a lantern hung on the hook inside the entrance, going through the inventory she'd built up over the past 3 weeks with the systematic attention of someone who could not afford to miscount. She had her notebook open on the shelf in front of her, and she was moving through the sections with her finger, whispering numbers under her breath. You counting again? Hector said from the doorway. Recounting, she said without looking up. There's a difference. Counting is what you do when you think you know what you have. Recounting is what you do when the situation changes and you need to know what you actually have. He came down the ramp and leaned against the shelf opposite her. And it's enough, she said. For us, for this ranch, with the number of people currently on the property, we could last 3 months without resupply if we're careful. She closed the notebook. It's not enough for the valley. Hector was quiet. He picked up a jar of preserved beans, turned it in his hands, set it back down. So what do you want to do? He said. I want to expand it, she said. I want to go into town today and start talking to people about pooling resources. Getting an inventory of what's already out there, spread across 40 families. If we know what exists, we can distribute it rationally, instead of having everyone hoard independently, and some families running out while others have surplus they don't know what to do with. People aren't going to want to tell you what they have, Hector said. He wasn't being discouraging, he was being accurate, which she appreciated. Especially when there's sickness coming. First instinct is to lock the door and protect your own. I know, she said. That's why I'm going to start with what we're willing to share, not what we're asking them to share. You lead with what you're giving, not with what you're asking for. Hector looked at her for a moment. Your mother teach you that too? No, Clara said. I figured that one out myself. Took a few failures. She drove the buggy into Silver Creek that morning with a list in her coat pocket and a specific sequence of conversations planned in her head, ordered by the likelihood of each person to be receptive, starting with the most probable and working outward. Her first stop was May Sutton, who ran the boarding house on the east end of Main Street and had lived in Silver Creek longer than almost anyone. May was perhaps 65, with a face like good leather and opinions she didn't bother softening for anyone. She had been one of the women standing outside the general store the day Clara arrived, arms folded, expression measuring. Clara knocked on the boarding house door and May opened it with the expression of someone who had been expecting something unpleasant and was mildly surprised to find it was just a person. "Miss Whitmore?" she said. "Mrs. Sutton, may I come in?" May stood aside. The boarding house parlor was warm and smelled of wood smoke and something baking. 3 of May's permanent residents, 2 older miners and a retired surveyor, were visible through the doorway to the dining room, nursing coffee. Clara sat down at May's kitchen table and laid out what she knew: the fever, the timeline, the roads, what the cellar contained, what the valley was likely to need. May listened without interrupting, which Clara had not quite expected. "You're telling me this first," May said when Clara finished, "before you go to Harmon or any of the bigger operations." "Yes." "Why?" "Because you've been here the longest," Clara said. "Because you know every family in this valley, and they trust you in a way they're not going to trust me. And because your boarding house is in the center of town, which means it's the most practical place to coordinate from." May looked at her steadily. "You want to use my house?" "I want to ask if you'd be willing to let us use it," Clara said. "There's a difference." Something shifted in May's expression, the same small fractional movement that Clara had noticed in Wyatt when she'd first challenged him, the look of a person reconsidering a judgment they'd already made. "Harriet Morse's youngest has the fever," May said. "Came down 2 days ago. You probably already knew that." "Dr. Cross told me." "Harriet's going to panic," May said. "She panics at normal things, and this isn't a normal thing." She picked up her own coffee cup, which had gone cold, and wrapped both hands around it anyway. "What exactly do you need from me?" Clara told her. By midday, she had spoken to 6 families. By mid-afternoon, 8. The responses varied in the way that human responses to bad news always varied. Some people received it with a kind of grim practicality that suggested they'd been quietly waiting for something like this. Some received it with the brittle cheerfulness of people who needed a day to process fear before they could act on it. One woman, a Mrs. Hollis, whose husband had been sick since Monday, received it by sitting down hard in a kitchen chair and covering her face with her hands for a full minute while Clara sat across from her and didn't say anything. The Hollis situation was the one Clara had been most concerned about. She'd asked Cross about it, and Cross had confirmed what she'd suspected. Gerald Hollis was in his 60s, with a chest that had never fully healed from a bout of pneumonia 3 winters back. The fever in a man like that was not a question of whether it would be serious. It was a question of degrees of serious. She left the Hollis house with a knot in her chest and the specific cold efficiency that she'd learned was the only useful thing to deploy when there was a great deal left to do and not enough time to do it. The last stop of the day was the general store. Tom Hadley was behind his counter when she came in, and he watched her approach with the expression he'd worn every time she'd come in to make purchases for the cellar. Slightly wary, slightly curious, doing a running calculation of what her presence might mean for his business. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "you here to clean me out again?" "Not today," she said. She set her notebook on the counter. "I want to talk to you about your inventory." He crossed his arms. "My inventory is my business." "It is," she said, "and I'm not asking you to give anything away or change your prices. I'm asking you to tell me what you have, specifically in the categories of preserved foods, lamp fuel, and basic medicines, so I know what the valley has access to and where the gaps are." "And why would I do that?" Clara looked at him steadily. Tom Hadley was not a bad man. He was a careful man, which in her experience sometimes looked the same from the outside. "Because in about 10 days, she said, the roads are probably going to close. And when the roads close, what's in this store is what this town has. If I know what that is, I can help make sure it lasts long enough for the roads to open again. If I don't know what it is, we're going to be making guesses at the worst possible time." Hadley was quiet. He looked at the counter, at the rows of tins and bags and bottles behind him. "You really think it's going to be that bad?" he said, and for the first time his voice didn't have the careful professional neutrality of a merchant. It had the slightly exposed quality of a man who lived alone above his store and had been watching the town around him with a quiet private worry he hadn't told anyone about. "I think it could be," Clara said. And I'd rather be ready for something bad that turns out to be moderate than be unprepared for something moderate that turns out to be bad. He unfolded his arms. All right, he said. Let me get my ledger. Chas. She got back to the ranch as the light was going. Wyatt was in the yard. She could tell from the way he was standing, weight forward, jaw set, that he'd been waiting for her, and that the waiting had not improved his mood. You've been in town all day, he said when she climbed down from the buggy. I have. Doing what, exactly? Talking to people. She handed Hector the reins without looking away from Wyatt, getting a picture of what the valley has and where it's concentrated. I know what you were doing, he said. I heard from Dale, who heard from Cole, who ran into Peter Voss's son at the feed store. He paused. You told May Sutton she could coordinate from the boarding house. I asked if she'd be willing to. She said yes, without talking to me first. Clara looked at him. The yard was cold, the last of the light bleeding out of the western sky in bands of orange and gray, and she was tired from a long day of carefully managing people's fear, and she was not in the mood for a conversation that was about territory rather than the actual problem. You're right, she said. I should have told you before I went. I apologize for that. She said it simply, without qualification, because she meant it. She had moved fast, and she should have communicated. But the answer I would have wanted from you was yes, so I need to know now. Are you willing to be part of this or not? He stared at her. Part of what, exactly? You haven't told me what this is. I want to set up a distribution system, she said, using the cellar as the anchor. I want to take inventory of what the valley has in total, identify the families with the least, and make sure they have enough to get through the next 6 to 8 weeks without running out. I want May's boarding house to be the coordination point in town, and I want the ranch to be the coordination point for the outlying families. Wyatt was quiet. And I want you to be the one who tells the valley it's happening, she said, because they'll listen to you in a way they won't listen to me. Not yet. That's why you need me, he said. It wasn't hostile, it was just direct. That's one reason I need you, she said. The other reason is that you're the wealthiest man in this valley, and if you participate, other people with resources will follow. If you don't, they won't. The wind pushed between them, carrying the smell of snow from somewhere not too distant. You've got it all worked out, he said. I've got a framework, she said. The details are going to be a mess, and half of it won't work the way I planned. But I'd rather have a framework that needs adjusting than no framework at all. Wyatt looked at the cellar door. At the earthen ramp going down, the heavy frame he'd helped build with his own hands on a cold November afternoon, when he jumped down into the pit because the work needed to go faster. What do you need me to do first? He said. Talk to the Decker family, she said. They're the ones furthest out from town with the least reserve. They have 5 children, and 2 of them are already sick. I went out there this afternoon and I gave them what I could carry in the buggy, but they need more, and they need someone to make sure they don't feel like charity cases when they receive it. James Decker's a proud man. I know, that's why I need you to go, not me. Wyatt was quiet for another moment. Then he said, I'll go in the morning. Thank you, she said. Then, there's something else. He looked at her. There usually is. I talked to Hadley about his stock today. He's got more than I expected in some categories and less in others. The medicine situation is the problem. Dr. Cross already said his supplies are inadequate, and what Hadley has in the store isn't going to bridge that gap. We need someone to ride to Caldwell City for resupply before the roads close. It needs to happen in the next 4 days. I can send Cole. Send Dale, she said. Cole's fast, but Dale's careful. I need someone who will look at a list and come back with exactly what's on it, not what seemed close enough. Wyatt blinked. It was a small thing, barely visible, but she caught it, the slight recalibration of a man who was used to being the one who made those assessments. Dale, he agreed. Dale left for Caldwell City 2 days later with a list that Clara had spent an evening building with Cross, the 2 of them at the doctor's office table with Cross's medical reference books open between them, Cross pointing at things he needed and Clara writing them down and asking why. Not to challenge him, but because she'd learned that understanding the purpose of a supply made her better at substituting when the exact item wasn't available. "You ask a lot of questions," Cross said at one point. "You give good answers," she said. "Most of the time." He looked at her. He had a particular expression he made when he was deciding whether to be offended and choosing not to be. "Most of the time," he repeated. "The quinine recommendation," she said. "The dosage. You're going by a standard that was set for adults in a moderate climate. We have children and elderly, and this climate puts additional strain on the body. I'd go higher." Cross put down his pen. "That's a dangerous suggestion without more data." "I know," she said. "I'm not telling you to do it. I'm telling you it's something worth thinking about." She looked at her list. "I'm also going to stock more of the elderberry preparation than you suggested. Before you object, I know it's not medicine in the way you mean medicine, but the recovery phase is going to be the killing phase for the weakest patients. Anything that supports nutrition and warmth during recovery is worth having." Cross looked at his hands for a moment. "You know," he said, "when Wyatt Blackwood sent word that he was bringing a wife from back east, I thought—" He stopped. "What did you think?" "I thought we were going to get a woman who'd spend the first winter complaining that the house wasn't warm enough and leave in the spring," Clara kept writing. "And instead you got someone arguing with you about quinine dosages." "Yes," he said. "I'm not entirely sure which I would have preferred." She smiled at that, a genuine one. "I'm not leaving," she said. "So you may as well get used to it." Otis. The fever moved the way Cross had predicted, which was to say it moved fast and without regard for who could afford to be sick and who couldn't. By the end of the first week, there were 19 confirmed cases in the valley. By the middle of the second week, 31. Clara was at the boarding house every morning by 7. May had cleared the large downstairs room that had once served as a second dining space, and it now functioned as a coordination center. Maps of the valley tacked to the wall, a running roster of affected families, a log of what had been distributed and to whom. The system was imperfect in exactly the ways Clara had predicted it would be. Some families were proud in the way that made them refuse help until they were desperate, at which point they needed more help than if they'd accepted it earlier. Some families misunderstood what they were supposed to do with what they received. The preserved broth, in particular, caused confusion, with 2 families diluting it so heavily in an effort to stretch it that it provided almost no nutritional value. Clara added a 1-page instruction sheet, handwritten, that went out with every distribution. May, it turned out, was an extraordinary organizer. She had a capacity for tracking detail that Clara respected genuinely and without reservation. The older woman could hold the status of every family in the valley in her head simultaneously, and she knew things about the social dynamics of Silver Creek that no map could convey. She knew which families were on bad terms with their neighbors and therefore couldn't be asked to coordinate. She knew which men in town would accept direction from another man but not from a woman, and she deployed Wyatt for exactly those conversations without being asked to. Wyatt had become, in the space of 2 weeks, something Clara hadn't entirely anticipated: a genuine partner. Not in the managed, careful way of their early negotiations, but in the real sense, showing up, doing the work, adapting when the plan changed, which it changed constantly. He rode out to the Decker farm the morning after their conversation. He came back that evening and reported to Clara not in the manner of a man recounting a task completed, but in the manner of someone who had been moved by something and was still processing it. James Decker, it turned out, had 2 children sick and a wife who was running out of the particular reserve that was harder to measure than food stores. The emotional reserve that a mother uses to keep fear from becoming visible to her sick children. Wyatt had sat with them for 2 hours. He'd helped Decker split wood. He'd left supplies without making them feel like recipients, which was the harder thing to do. "He's a stubborn man," Wyatt said that evening. "But he's not stupid stubborn. He's scared stubborn. There's a difference." "I know," Clara said. "His youngest is 4 years old." He said it and then didn't say anything else for a moment. "She's got red hair, same shade as—" He stopped again. Clara didn't fill the silence. She had learned in these weeks that there were silences that wanted to be filled and silences that needed to breathe. After a moment, Wyatt said, "I'll go back in 2 days." "Yes," she said. "That would be good." Dale came back from Caldwell City on the 6th day with a full wagon and a 3-day-old newspaper from the territorial capital that contained, among other things, a brief article about a fever outbreak spreading through the western settlements. Clara read the article standing in the yard with her coat half-buttoned, Dale watching her from the wagon seat. "It's not just us," she said. "No, ma'am," Dale said. He was a man who used words sparingly, and this appeared to be about all he had to offer on the subject. She read it again. The territorial report estimated 22 settlements affected, with varying severity. The settlements with the worst outcomes were the ones with limited food stores and poor internal organization, the ones that had been relying on supply lines that the weather had severed. The settlements with the best outcomes were, so far, the ones that had managed to pool resources and limit contact in the early phase. She folded the newspaper and put it in her coat pocket. "Good work," she told Dale. "Get the wagon unloaded and then get some rest." She took the paper to Cross that afternoon. He read it at his desk with his reading glasses on and a very still expression. "It confirms what we're doing is right," he said when he'd finished. "It confirms what we're doing might work," she said. "That's not quite the same thing." Cross looked at her over his glasses. "You're not comforting to be around, do you know that?" "I've heard that before," she said. "I'm not trying to be uncomfortable. I'm trying to be accurate." "They're the same thing most of the time." She almost laughed. "Unfortunately," she said. "Yes." The cold came on a Thursday, 8 days after Cross's prediction, which was close enough to confirm what everyone in the valley had been quietly hoping was wrong. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 18 hours. The sky turned the particular flat white of a sky that has made up its mind. By Friday morning, the first snow was falling, and by Friday evening, it was not stopping. Claire stood on the porch of the boarding house at dusk and watched the main street of Silver Creek disappear beneath 6 inches of white and still accumulating. The few lanterns still lit in shop windows turned the falling snow orange and gold, which would have been beautiful under other circumstances, and was still, in spite of everything, somewhat beautiful now. May came to stand beside her. She had a shawl over her shoulders and a mug of something hot, and she stood with the look of a woman who had survived enough winters to know that surviving one more required neither panic nor false confidence. 31 sick, May said, as of this morning. 32, Clara said. Tom Hadley came down this afternoon. I stopped in on my way here. May absorbed this. He lives alone. I know. I left him with what he needed for the next 4 days and arranged for Mrs. Ferris's son to check on him tomorrow morning. She paused. I also found his inventory log. He'd left it on the counter. I made a copy before I came here. May was quiet for a moment. Then she said with a dryness that Clara had come to appreciate, You made a copy of the man's business records while he was sick. I made a copy so that when he's better and the store is running again, we'll know what needs to be restocked first, Clara said. I left him a note explaining that I'd done it and why. He's going to have opinions about that. He's going to have opinions about a lot of things, Clara said. So do I. We'll manage. She looked at the snow. How many of the outlying families do you think we haven't reached yet? 4, maybe 5. The Winslow place out past the ridge. Old Bartlett, though he's been sick himself and his daughter has probably taken over. The Shoe family. They don't always come into town, so I'm not sure what their situation is. May paused. Wyatt went out to the shoe place today, before the snow got bad. He thought of it himself. Clara turned to look at her. He's not the man he was 2 months ago, May said simply. I don't know what you did, but he went out to the shoe place on his own because he thought of them and didn't want them to be overlooked. Clara looked back at the snow. I didn't do anything, she said. He was already that person. He just needed a reason to be it again. May made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite skepticism. Maybe, she said, or maybe the right person showing up at the right time is the same thing as doing something. The snow kept falling. Inside the boarding house, someone had built up the fire, and the warmth of it was visible through the windows in the way that warmth becomes visible when the world outside is cold enough, the glass fogging slightly at the edges, the light inside appearing to pulse with a kind of aliveness that the dark outside did not have. We need to talk about the cellar, Clara said. I know, May said. The supplies I have there are going to sustain the recovery phase for maybe 60% of the valley's population, Clara said. If the snow doesn't break within 3 weeks, we're going to run short on the broths and the preserved protein. The grain will hold, the root vegetables will hold, but the high-value recovery nutrition is going to run thin. How thin? Thin enough that I need to know what every family in the valley has stored and what they're willing to contribute, Clara said. Not asking any more? I need to actually know. May was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I'll have the list by Monday. The snow might not give us until Monday. Then I'll have it by Sunday, May said. Go home, Clara. Sleep. You've been going 18 hours a day for 2 weeks, and you are not actually indestructible, regardless of what you appear to believe about yourself. Clara opened her mouth and then closed it again, because May was right, and because being told a true thing by someone who meant well was something she'd learned to accept rather than deflect. Sunday, she said. All right. She walked to her buggy through the snow that was already past her ankles, and she drove back to the Blackwood Ranch in the cold dark with the list in her coat pocket and the newspaper folded beside her on the seat, and the quiet knowledge that the hardest weeks were still ahead and that they were as ready as they could be, which was not quite the same thing as ready enough. May had the list by Saturday. She arrived at the ranch in the early afternoon with it tucked inside her coat against her chest, riding in Peter Voss's son's wagon because her own horse had thrown a shoe the night before, and nobody was going to the farrier until the snow let up. She came into the kitchen where Clara was working, set the folded papers on the table without ceremony, and accepted the coffee Esther offered with both hands, and a silence that communicated more than words would have. Clara opened the list. It was 8 pages, dense with May's small, careful handwriting. 40 families, their known stores, their current sick count, their able-bodied adults, their children under 12. The final column on each entry was labeled in May's notation as situation, and the entries in that column ranged from stable to concerning to 2, that simply said critical. The Hollis family was one of the critical entries. The Winslow family, out past the ridge, was the other. Gerald Hollis died Thursday night, May said from behind her coffee cup. Clara had suspected it. She had not known it until this moment. She kept her eyes on the page for a moment, then looked up. And Mrs. Hollis? She's sick herself now. Started yesterday. May set down her cup. Her sister is with her, Agnes Pryor. You met her. She came to the coordination meeting last week. I remember her. Clara had liked Agnes Pryor. A steady woman, the kind who asked practical questions rather than emotional ones. The children? 3 of the 4 have had it and are recovering. The youngest hasn't shown symptoms yet, which either means she escaped it or she's still in the incubation window. May paused. Agnes is managing, but they need more of the recovery broth than you sent last time. Clara made a note. She turned to the last page of the list where May had done a total calculation. All known stores across the valley, sorted by category, measured against estimated need for a 4-week closure scenario. The numbers were not catastrophic. They were not comfortable either. They sat in the narrow corridor between those two things, where a run of bad luck or a decision made wrong could tip them in either direction. You did the math yourself, Clara said. I ran a boarding house for 20 years, May said. Math is the job. The protein stores are the problem, Clara said. We have adequate grain and adequate root vegetables, but the preserved meat and the broth base is going to run short around week 3 if the case count keeps climbing. The case count is going to keep climbing, May said flatly. We both know that. Yes. Clara folded the list and held it in both hands. I need to talk to Wyatt. He was in the barn with Dale and 2 other hands, dealing with a cow that had chosen this particular week to have a difficult calving. Clara stood in the barn doorway until he looked up, and something in her expression must have communicated that this was not a conversation that could wait, because he handed the rope he was holding to Dale and came toward her. What is it? Week 3, she said. That's when the recovery nutrition runs short. The broth base, the preserved meat, the rendered fat for cooking. We have adequate stores for stable families managing normal winter consumption, but we have 41 families consuming above normal because sick people need more support than healthy ones. and the recovery phase takes more nutritional resource than the acute phase. Wyatt leaned against the barn wall and looked at her. His coat had something on the sleeve she decided not to ask about. How short? Meaningfully short. Not everyone's starve is short, but weak people don't fully recover short, which in this weather, in this phase of illness, becomes life-threatening. And the solution is? The cattle, she said. He was quiet. Not many, she said. I've done the math. 6 head would cover the gap for a 4-week closure, properly processed and distributed. 8 head would give us a buffer. She watched him. Wyatt Blackwood's cattle were not simply money. She understood that, in a way that went beyond the practical. They represented 12 years of accumulation, of a life rebuilt from loss. Asking him to reduce his herd was not a small thing, and she was not going to pretend it was. 6 head, he said. 6 is the minimum. 8 is the margin for error. He pushed off the wall. Looked at the barn's interior, the animals, the stored feed, the particular organized industry of a place that had been built to sustain itself. Then he looked back at her. 8, he said. Talk to Dale about which ones. Clara let out a breath she hadn't been entirely aware she was holding. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, he said. The processing is going to take 2 days, and we're doing it in this cold, which is not ideal. He paused. And I want to be there when you tell Cross what you're doing. He's going to want to supervise the distribution. He should supervise the distribution, Clara said. It's medicine. The quantities matter. Wyatt looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize as the one he made when she'd said something he'd expected to have to argue her into. All right, he said. I'll send coal for Cross in the morning. Whoa. The morning brought 8 more inches of snow and 2 new cases that Hector brought word of when he came in from checking the perimeter fence. The Shu family's eldest son, 17 years old, and old Bartlett's daughter, who had been caring for her father and had now been felled by the same thing she'd been fighting to protect him from. Clara absorbed this at the kitchen table with her second cup of coffee and her notebook open in front of her and Esther moving quietly behind her, refilling things without being asked. The daughter's name is Ruth, Esther said, unprompted, from the stove. Ruth Bartlett. She's 32. Her husband died 4 years ago, left her with the farm and her father to care for. Clara looked up. Esther was stirring something in a pot with her back to the room, her posture suggesting she hadn't said anything in particular. You know her? Clara said. I know everybody, Esther said. I've been in this valley 15 years. Clara had asked Esther very few direct questions about herself or about the valley's social geography, partly because she hadn't wanted to seem like she was extracting information, and partly because Esther had not invited questions. But this felt like something different, like Esther offering, in her sideways fashion, something she thought was relevant. What else do you know about the Bartlett place? Clara asked. That it's 3 miles past the Winslow property, and the road between them drifts badly in heavy snow. And that Ruth Bartlett is one of those people who would work herself to death before she'd ask for help, because her father is that way, and she was raised to be the same. Clara wrote Bartlett, Ruth, on her list. Then she wrote send directly, don't wait for request. Thank you, Esther, she said. Esther made a sound that was neither acknowledgement nor dismissal and kept stirring. Cross arrived by mid-morning, having ridden in from town on a horse that looked as unhappy about the weather as a horse could communicate. He came into the kitchen in a cloud of cold air and the expression of a man who had not slept more than 5 hours in 4 days and was running on something stonier than coffee. He looked at Clara's notebook, spread across the table with May's list beside it and her own distribution log beside that. And for a moment he just stood there in his snow-covered coat, looking at the organized evidence of 3 weeks of systematic work. 43 cases, he said. As of this morning, Clara said. 2 new ones Hector brought word of. I need to update the list. I have 5 in what I'd call critical condition. He sat down heavily across from her, and Esther put coffee in front of him without being asked, which was the closest thing to grace she seemed to offer. Gerald Hollis was the first. I'm worried about 2 others. Peter Voss himself, which is going to hit this valley hard because he's the one people look to for weather reading and planting knowledge, and a young woman named Carrie Sutton, May's granddaughter. Clara's hand stopped on the notebook. May's granddaughter. 18 years old, she arrived from the east 2 weeks before the fever started. Came to help her grandmother through the winter. Wrong time to come. Cross wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. May doesn't know how serious it is yet. I told her it was moderate. It's not moderate. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the stove and the wind outside. How long does she have if the trajectory doesn't change? Clara said. The fever alone won't kill her, but she's young and her body has spent everything on the acute phase. If she goes into recovery without adequate nutrition and warmth, and if there's any secondary infection, he stopped. A week, maybe 10 days before we'd know which way it's going. Clara was already reaching for a different section of her inventory. I have a specific preparation for post-fever recovery. It's dense in the nutrients the body prioritizes for immune rebuilding. My grandmother's formulation, not mine. She developed it after watching people survive the fever and die in the 2 weeks after. She found the page. I've been rationing it because the ingredients are finite. I was planning to distribute it on a case-by-case basis as people move from acute to recovery phase. Move Carrie Sutton to the top of that list, Cross said without hesitation. Already done, Claire said. She wrote the name. Then, does May know you're here? She knows I wrote out this morning. She thinks I'm checking the distribution schedule with you. He paused. She's going to figure out her granddaughter's condition on her own within the next day or two, regardless. She's a sharp woman. I know, Clara said. When she does, she's going to want to be told the truth, not a softened version of it. I know that too, Cross said. He said it with the slightly tired weight of a man who had been dealing with the gap between what people needed to hear and what they could bear to hear for most of his professional life, and had made an uneasy peace with the fact that the gap never fully closed. The processing of the 8 cattle happened over 2 days in the cold that made the work brutal in the specific way that outdoor physical labor in hard winter is brutal. Not dramatic, just grinding, the kind of effort that takes something out of a person that sleep doesn't fully restore. Wyatt worked alongside his men both days, which Clara had not expected and which she noticed the hands noticed too. Cole, to his credit, worked without complaint for the first time since Clara could remember. She suspected it had something to do with the conversation Wyatt had with him the evening before it started, behind the closed door of the office. She hadn't heard what was said, only the tone, which was not angry, but was not gentle either. The meat was packed and sectioned and loaded into the cellar in quantities Clara had calculated against the distribution list. She worked the cellar inventory herself, reorganizing the shelving to accommodate the new stores, moving things with the methodical efficiency of someone who had learned that a disorganized cellar is nearly as useless as an empty one when you're looking for something specific in low light and freezing cold. Hector helped her. He worked with the quiet competence that she'd come to rely on, and at one point, moving a heavy crate to the back shelf, he said, "You know what you have down here is more than food." Clara set down the jar she was holding and looked at him. "You've got proof," he said, "that it was worth doing, that the 3 weeks of digging and the arguments and the money and all of it, it was worth it." He slid the crate into place. Not everybody gets proof that fast. Sometimes you do the right thing and you die before you find out if it worked. "We don't know yet if it worked," Clara said. "No," he said. "But we know it's working. That's more than most people get." She looked at the shelves, the organized rows, the labeled jars and crates, the meticulous accounting of what was there and what it was for. It didn't feel like proof yet. It felt like a problem she was still inside of, but she understood what Hector meant, and she filed it away in the part of her mind that she returned to when the weight of the thing became heavy enough to need something to lean against. She was at the boarding house when May found out about Carrie. It happened the way things like that happened. Not through a deliberate disclosure, but through the accumulation of small evidence that a sharp person assembles faster than anyone intends. May had come into the room where Carrie was resting to bring soup, and she had stood in the doorway looking at her granddaughter for perhaps 10 seconds, and then she had come downstairs and found Clara at the coordination table and said quietly, "Tell me how bad it is." Clara looked up from the distribution log. "Don't soften it," May said. I've been in this valley 30 years, and I've sat with dying people, and I've sat with sick people who looked like they were dying and weren't. I know the difference. Tell me what you know. Clara told her, directly, accurately, with the same tone she would have wanted if their positions were reversed. Not cold, not theatrical, just truthful. May sat down. She sat very still for a moment, her hands flat on the table. What can be done? She said. We move her to the top of the recovery nutrition list. We keep her warm. The room she's in has a draft from the north window. We need to address that today. We keep fluids in her, and we watch for secondary infection, which is the real danger. Clara paused. Dr. Cross will come every day. I'll come every day. We're not going to leave her without attention. May's jaw was set in a way that communicated she was not going to cry in front of anyone, and that the decision had been made before Clara finished speaking. All right, she said. What do I do? Stay with her as much as you can, not because she needs nursing every minute. She doesn't, but because she knows you're there, and that matters in ways that don't appear in any medical record. Clara held May's gaze. And keep running the coordination, because 31 other families need this system to keep functioning, and you're the one who's holding it together. May looked at her. It was a long look, the kind that takes the measure of a person not for the first time, but more deeply than before. You're harder than you look, May said. My mother said the same thing, Clara said. She meant it as a compliment. So do I, May said. She pushed back from the table. The north window. I'll have it seen to within the hour. The snow did not break. The third week opened under a sky that had forgotten any color other than white and gray, with temperatures that made the walk from the boarding house to the nearest homes a considered undertaking rather than a casual one. Specific information that people needed to not feel entirely cut off from each other. He went out every morning before sunrise and came back after dark. And he came back different every day in the way that people who spend time with suffering come back different, not broken by it, but added to. Clara noticed this in the evenings, when he came in from the cold and sat at the kitchen table and reported what he'd found. He no longer reported in the flat, logistical manner of the early weeks. He reported with people in them. The Decker girl with red hair who had graduated from broth to solid food and had greeted him by showing him a picture she'd drawn. Old Peter Voss, who had rallied enough to sit up and had spent an hour talking Wyatt through the signs of a late winter thaw to watch for when the weather shifted. Ruth Bartlett, who had fought the fever alone for 3 days before accepting that she could not manage her father and her own illness simultaneously, and had finally, in May's words, let someone help. One evening he came in and sat down and didn't start with the report. He just sat for a moment with his coat still on, turning his hat in his hands. Clara waited. James Decker's middle boy, he said. Thomas. 8 years old. He didn't make it. The kitchen went quiet. Esther turned from the stove. Clara set down her pen. She didn't reach for something to say, because there wasn't something to say that wouldn't shrink the thing by the act of naming it. She just sat across from him and let the information exist in the room. After a while, Wyatt said, James held together. Better than I would have. You don't know that, Clara said. He looked at her. I know myself. You know the man you were 4 years ago, she said quietly. That's not necessarily the same man. Something moved in his face. Not quite pain, not quite recognition, something between. He looked back at his hat. 62 cases now, he said, returning to the report, which was how he put the conversation somewhere he could carry it without it stopping him. I know, Clara said. Cross told me this afternoon. And our stores? Adequate for another 10 days at current consumption, she said. After that, it depends on whether more families are willing to contribute from their private reserves. They haven't been willing before. They haven't needed to be before, she said. People are more willing to give when they can see exactly what it's going toward and who it's helping. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. You want to have a meeting? I want to have a meeting, she said. In town? At May's. In 3 days. Everyone who can get there. I want people to see what we've managed so far, the numbers, the cases, the recoveries, and I want to ask directly what more people are willing to contribute. And if they say no, then I'll work with what we have, Claire said. But I don't think they'll say no. I think people who have been watching their neighbors get sick and watching the system keep those neighbors alive are going to have a different calculation than they did 3 weeks ago. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. 3 weeks ago, you didn't ask me to do anything. You showed me your list and waited for me to decide. Yes, she said. Why differently now? She thought about this honestly rather than reaching for the ready answer. Because 3 weeks ago, I needed you to choose this, she said. Now you already have. And now what I need is for you to stand in a room full of people who still haven't and be the reason they reconsider. He held her gaze. Then he put his hat on the table and said, Set the meeting for Thursday. Umtet. Cross came to the ranch the following day with 2 things: his daily report on the critical cases and a question he'd apparently been working up to for several days. He sat across from Clara at the kitchen table after Wyatt had gone out to the barn, and he put his hands flat on the table and said, I want to talk to you about what you're doing with the recovery protocol. All right, Clara said. I've been watching the cases you're managing versus the cases I'm managing alone. He said this carefully, like a man dismantling something he'd built with a lot of effort. The survival rate in the recovery phase is better where your interventions are active. Meaningfully better, not slightly. Clara waited. I've been practicing medicine for 22 years, Cross said. I know what I know. I also know, and this is harder to say, that what I know has limits, and that some of what you know is not in any of my books and is working anyway. It's in other books, Clara said, not unkindly. Just older ones. Yes. He looked at his hands. I want to formalize what we're doing. I want to document the recovery protocol, what you're using, what quantities, what timing, so that if something happens to you, the information isn't lost. The directness of it, if something happens to you, landed with a particular weight. Nothing's going to happen to me, Clara said. You've been working 18-hour days for 3 weeks in a valley with 62 fever cases, Cross said. You haven't been sick yet. I don't know if that's constitution or luck, but I don't want to rely on it indefinitely. She looked at him. It was the most human thing he'd said to her in all the time she'd known him. Not the medical logic of it, but the underneath of it. The acknowledgement that she was a person who could be lost, and that would be its own kind of crisis. All right, she said. Come back Thursday evening after the meeting and we'll document it together. Before the meeting, Cross said, I want the documentation done before. She recognized this for what it was, not pessimism, but a doctor's habit of preparation that was identical in structure to everything she'd been doing herself for 3 weeks. She nodded. Tuesday morning, here, at the kitchen table. Cross nodded. He picked up his bag. Then, at the door, he stopped and turned back. Carrie Sutton, he said. Clara's breath held for a moment. She took solid food this morning, he said, and she asked her grandmother to read to her, which is a sign. I know what it's a sign of, Clara said. The tension in her chest released in a way that made her aware of how long it had been there. That's good news. It's early good news, Cross said, in the tone of a man who had been burned by early good news before. But yes, he pushed his hat on. It's good news. He left, and Clara sat alone in the kitchen for a moment with her notebook closed in front of her and the stove working behind her and the sound of the wind that never quite stopped. She allowed herself 30 seconds of something that was not quite relief and not quite hope, but lived in the same neighborhood. The specific feeling of a crisis that had not broken yet, but had, in one small corner, begun to turn. Then she opened the notebook and went back to work, because 30 seconds was what she had, and 62 cases didn't wait for more than that. The documentation session with Cross happened Tuesday morning as planned, which was to say it happened in the gap between 2 crises rather than in the calm Clara had hoped for, but had not genuinely expected. She had been up since 5. A rider had come in at 4:30. Cole, who had done a perimeter check of the near homesteads, with word that the Ferris family's situation had shifted overnight. Mrs. Ferris, who had been managing the mild end of the fever spectrum for the past week, had developed the secondary chest complication that Cross had been warning about in his older and weaker patients. She was 53, not old by the absolute measure of things, but old enough that her body's reserves were not what they'd been, and the chest complication in that demographic was the thing Cross feared most. Claire had sent Cole back with a specific bundle from the cellar, the eucalyptus preparation she'd been rationing, a quantity of the dense recovery broth, and a handwritten note for Agnes Pryor, who was managing the Ferris household in addition to the Hollis situation, because Agnes was apparently the kind of woman the Valley deployed wherever things were worst and trusted to hold together under the weight. By the time Cross arrived at 7, Clara had updated the log, reorganized the medical section of her distribution list to reflect the new priority, and eaten half a piece of bread that Esther had set in front of her with the wordless insistence of someone who had watched her skip meals 3 days running. Cross came in and looked at the table and said, "What happened?" "Ferris," she said. "Chest complication. I've sent the eucalyptus preparation." He sat down and opened his bag and pulled out his own notes. He had been keeping parallel documentation, she knew, and the fact that they'd never formally compared them until now was a gap she should have closed earlier. "That's the third chest complication this week," he said. "Gunderson last Thursday, Old Bartlett on Saturday, now Ferris." "Gunderson is improving," Clara said. "I checked the log. He took the preparation twice daily for 4 days, and the improvement was measurable by day 3. "Measurable how?" "Agnes Pryor's notation. She said his breathing was easier, and he stopped running fever on the morning of day 4. Clara found the page and turned it to face him. "I know that's not the clinical observation you'd want, but it's what we have." Cross looked at the notation. His expression was the one he wore when something was contradicting a conviction he wasn't ready to release. A tightening around the eyes, a stillness in the jaw. "All right," he said finally, and the words carried more weight than their size because, from Cross, all right was not a casual concession. It was an acknowledgement. They spent 2 hours documenting. She walked him through the recovery protocol in the same way her mother had walked her through it years ago. Not as a list of ingredients and quantities, but as a logic, so that the person using it understood why each element was there and could therefore substitute intelligently when something wasn't available. Cross asked precise questions. She gave precise answers. Occasionally they disagreed, and they had learned by now how to disagree productively, which was to say they stated their positions, explained their reasoning, and reached a notation that reflected the honest state of their combined knowledge without falsely resolving the uncertainty. By 9 o'clock, the document was 8 pages, written in Cross's neat hand because his handwriting was more legible than hers under normal conditions, and substantially more legible under the conditions of the past 3 weeks. 2 copies, Claire said. "One stays here, one goes to May's." "And one to my office," Cross said. 3 copies. He blotted the last page. "You should sleep," he said. "Thursday," she said. "After the meeting." He looked at her with the expression of a man who had made the same medical recommendation enough times to know when it wasn't going to be followed and had decided that continued repetition was an undignified use of his time. "After the meeting," he agreed and packed his bag and left. The Thursday meeting was Wyatt's idea in execution, even if it was Clara's in origin. He was the one who rode into town the day before and told people directly, not through intermediaries, not through posted notices, but face to face, the way things had been communicated in this valley before anyone had thought to write them down. He told them what the meeting was for, which was to take stock of where they stood and to talk honestly about what the next 3 weeks would need. He told them that Clara would be there with the numbers and that he would be there as himself, which in this valley meant something specific. She drove in with him Thursday morning, the 2 of them in the wagon with Hector at the reins because the road had been partially cleared by 2 of the Sioux boys the day before, a gesture that Clara noted in her log under the category of things that happened without being asked for. The cold had settled into the particular bone-dry quality of a winter that had committed itself fully, the kind of cold that didn't fluctuate but simply existed, flat and total, at the bottom of everything. May had the boarding house dining room arranged in the way Clara would have arranged it if she'd been the one arranging it. Chairs in a rough circle rather than rows, which communicated conversation rather than lecture. A table at one side with coffee and whatever May had been able to put together for food. A fire that was actually adequate for the size of the room, which was not always the case in boarding house dining rooms. 23 people came. Given the weather and the condition of the roads, Clara considered this more than she'd hoped for. She recognized most of them by now. The Decker family, James and his wife Margaret, both visibly worn in the way that parents who've lost a child are worn, a grief that lived in the body as much as in the expression. Agnes Pryor, who sat with the straight-backed economy of a woman running on less sleep than she needed but unwilling to let it show. Tom Hadley, recovered from his own bout with the fever and back to his merchant's watchfulness, thinner than he'd been, with a new quality in his eyes that Clara recognized as the particular alertness of someone who had been genuinely frightened and was still processing the aftermath. Peter Voss's son, representing his father, who was not yet well enough to travel. The Shu family's patriarch, a quiet man named Liang, who had come with his eldest daughter as translator, though he understood more English than he typically let on. Cross sat to Clara's left. Wyatt stood near the back wall, which she had not expected but which she understood immediately. He was positioning himself as a participant rather than a presider, which was exactly right. Clara stood at the front of the room with her notebook and May's list and the 8-page documentation she and Cross had produced 2 days prior, and she talked for perhaps 20 minutes, not with the performance of someone making a case, but with the plain directness of someone reporting on a situation to people who needed accurate information in order to make decisions. She told them the case count, 67 now, up from 62. She told them the recovery numbers, which were better than the raw case count suggested. 51 recovering, 11 still in acute or early recovery phase, 4 that Cross classified as critical. She told them what had been consumed from the collective stores over the past 3 weeks. She told them what remained, she told them what the next 3 weeks would need if the weather held, and the case count continued at the current rate of growth. Then she told them the gap. The room was quiet when she finished. Not the uncomfortable quiet of people who hadn't expected bad news, but the working quiet of people who were doing the arithmetic themselves and arriving at the same place she had. Tom Hadley spoke first. "You're saying we're short on the recovery nutrition by roughly a third." "By roughly a third, yes, if we reach the case projections I'm working from," Clara said. "If the fever peaks in the next 10 days and begins declining, the gap is smaller. If it continues at the current rate for 3 weeks, the gap is what I've described." "And the consequence of that gap," Hadley said, with the precision of a man who dealt in inventory and understood what shortage meant in practical terms. "The consequence is that people in recovery, people who have already survived the fever itself, won't have adequate nutrition during the period when their bodies are most vulnerable to secondary complications." She paused. "That's the phase where we lose people who shouldn't be lost. Thomas Decker was not in that category. His illness was severe from the start, but there are people in this valley right now who have survived the worst of the fever and are in the window where what happens next will determine whether they make a full recovery or whether we lose them." She let that sit for a moment. James Decker had not moved since she mentioned his son's name. His wife had placed her hand over his on his knee. He was looking at the floor with the expression of a man who was listening very hard to something that cost him to hear. "What do you need?" he said, without looking up. Clara looked at him. "I need to know what people have stored at home that they'd be willing to contribute," she said. "I'm not asking anyone to leave themselves without. I'm asking people to think honestly about what they have in surplus and what they can share." The room started talking, not chaos, organized disagreement, the kind of conversation that happens when people are trying to solve a real problem rather than perform concern about it. Hadley raised the question of fairness in distribution, which was a legitimate question. Liang Su raised his hand and said, through his daughter, that his family had a quantity of smoked pork from the autumn slaughter that they had not contributed because they had not known it was needed, and that they would like to contribute it now. This landed in the room with a weight that shifted something. May, who had not spoken yet, said, "I have 60 pounds of dried beans in the boarding house basement that I've been keeping back because I didn't know how long the winter would run. I'm putting them in." One by one, 3 more people offered specific things, not abstractions, specific things with quantities. Clara wrote each one down in her notebook. Then the room went quiet again, and she could feel the people who hadn't spoken yet doing the calculation that comes before a difficult decision. The calculation of personal risk against communal need, the oldest tension in human organization. Wyatt moved from the back wall. He walked to the center of the room and stood there with his hat in his hands, and he said, "I've got 4 more cattle I can put in. Beyond what I've already given. He said it without preamble, without the performance of generosity, as flatly as if he were stating the weather. And I've got 50 bushels of winter grain in the upper barn that I've been holding as seed reserve. I'll put in 30 of them, keep 20 for spring planting. The room was very still. Clara watched it happen. The thing she'd believed would happen, but hadn't been certain of until she saw it. The calculation changed for people when Wyatt spoke. Not because he was wealthy, or not only because of that, but because he was Wyatt Blackwood, who had built this operation from nothing and held it for 12 years and was known as a man who did not give things away carelessly. And he was standing in the center of a room saying that what they were doing together was worth more than his seed reserve, which was worth more than most people in that room could calculate. A man named Henry Garvey, who had said nothing so far and whose family Clara knew had a meaningful store of preserved goods they hadn't disclosed, cleared his throat. "I've got smoked venison," he said. 40 pounds, maybe more. It's been sitting because my wife's the one who usually decides what to do with the stores, and she's been sick. He paused. She'd want it to go in. The conversation after that was different. It was not unanimous. There were two families who said nothing and contributed nothing, and Clara made no note of this beyond a simple absence in the inventory column, because people's fears were their own, and she was not in the business of shaming anyone into generosity. But when May tallied the new contributions at the end of the meeting, the gap had closed from a third to something under 15%, which was a number the existing reserves could absorb if the fever peaked on the timeline Cross expected. People stayed for coffee after the formal meeting. Clara moved through the room doing the things she had not been able to do from behind a notebook, checking in with Agnes about the Ferris situation, having a quiet conversation with Liang Su's daughter about what the family needed that they might not have asked for, standing for a moment with James Decker in a corner of the room because he had made his way to her specifically. "You saved a lot of people," he said, not as a compliment, as a fact he was delivering because he felt she needed to have it. "The system saved a lot of people," she said. He shook his head. "Don't do that. My boy died. I know what that means. I also know that 4 other children in this valley didn't die who might have because of what you built." He looked at her directly, and his eyes had the rawness in them of someone who had been crying recently and had decided to stop. "Don't make it small by distributing the credit so thin nobody gets any." Clara held his gaze. "I'm sorry about Thomas," she said. "I'm genuinely sorry." "I know you are," he said. "That's why I'm talking to you." He went back to his wife, and Clara stood in the corner of the boarding house dining room for a moment with the noise of the meeting around her and James Decker's words sitting in her chest in the way that true things sit. Not comfortable, not uncomfortable, just weighted. Wyatt found her later, outside on the boarding house porch, where she'd stepped for a minute of cold air that she needed more than she needed warmth. He came out and stood beside her without asking why she was out there, which was one of the things about him she had come to appreciate. He did not require explanation for the basic human need to step away from a room. They stood for a while without talking. The main street was quiet, the snow muffling everything, the late afternoon light turning the white surface of the road a pale amber that was going to be gone in 20 minutes. "You're thinking about the gap," he said eventually. "I'm thinking about a lot of things," she said. "The 15%. That, yes." She had her arms crossed against the cold. "If Cross's projection is right, and the fever peaks in 10 days, we're fine. If it doesn't peak, if we get another week of acceleration before it turns, we're going to be making decisions I don't want to make about distribution." Such as? Such as who gets the recovery nutrition first when there isn't enough for everyone who needs it simultaneously. She looked at the street. "I've been trying not to think about that scenario because thinking about it feels like conceding it's possible. But it's possible." Wyatt was quiet. "I don't have a good answer for it," she said. "Cross and I would make medical decisions. Most critical cases first, which sounds clear until you're standing in front of 2 people with equal severity and 1 limited portion." She stopped. "I've been in that position before. Not with fever, with drought, when I was 12. My mother had to decide which fields got the water and which didn't. I watched her make that decision, and I watched what it cost her." "What did it cost her?" Wyatt said. "She got it right," Clara said, "and she still thought about it for years after, because getting it right doesn't always mean you don't carry it." He turned to look at her. In the cold air, his breath showed faintly, and his expression was the most unguarded she'd seen it. The walls he kept up with most people, the careful self-containment of a man who'd been hurt badly enough to make that containment necessary, were not entirely down, but were not fully up either. "You've been carrying this whole thing," he said, "for 3 weeks." "We've been carrying it," she said. "Not the same weight," he said. "Don't do to yourself what you just told me not to do to you. You built this. You saw it before anyone else saw it. You talked to people when they didn't want to be talked to, and you organized something that had no reason to hold together except that you decided it would." He paused. "That's not nothing." She looked at him. "You went to the Decker farm before I asked you to," she said. "You sat with James Decker when Thomas died. You gave up a third of your seed grain this morning in front of 20 people, and you made it look like nothing." "It's not nothing either," he said, "but you knew that already." They stood for another moment in the cold, and the amber light deepened toward the color of old copper, and somewhere down the street a door opened and a rectangle of yellow warmth spilled out onto the snow, and then closed again. "I need to tell you something," Wyatt said. Clara waited. "When you first talked to me about the cellar, back in October, in the yard, when you told me we didn't have adequate emergency storage, my first thought was that you were wrong." He said this with the particular effort of a man stating something he's decided needs to be said, even though it doesn't reflect well on him. "Not that you were naive or inexperienced. I thought you were wrong the way I thought women who didn't know the land were wrong, like you were applying some theory to a place that operated by different rules." "I know," Clara said. "I could tell. I want you to know that I was—" "Wyatt," she said, not cutting him off but redirecting him gently. "You jumped down into that pit and handed me back the pickaxe. That told me everything it needed to tell me." He was quiet. "I don't need you to say it," she said. "I just need you to keep doing what you've been doing." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see in his face something that was working its way toward the surface after a long time underground. Not dramatic, not sudden, just present in the way that things are present when they've been kept down long enough, and the keeping down finally costs more than the having. "You're not what I expected," he said. "When I arranged this, I thought—" He stopped. "It doesn't matter what I thought. It was wrong." "Tell me anyway," she said. "Someday. When this is over." He looked at her. "When this is over," he agreed. They went back inside. The days that followed had a different quality than the weeks before them. The crisis was still fully present. The case count didn't drop, the weather didn't break, the morning report still brought news that required immediate response. But the coordination had a momentum to it now, a practiced efficiency that was the result of 3 weeks of adjustment and error and correction, and the people within the system had learned to trust it in the incremental way that trust is built, which is through the accumulation of small-kept promises rather than any single large demonstration. Agnes Pryor had by this point become, without anyone formally appointing her, the primary daily operations manager for the in-town distribution. She had a mind for logistics that matched Clara's in some dimensions and exceeded it in others. She understood the social texture of the valley in ways that Clara was still learning, and she knew how to move through it without friction, which was a skill that Clara had and was improving but had not fully mastered. Mrs. Ferris improved on the 8th day after her chest complication, which Cross noted in his log with the professional restraint of a man who had trained himself not to celebrate recoveries prematurely and who was celebrating this one internally with more feeling than he would acknowledge. Clara knew this because she had been present when he read the morning report from Agnes, and his hand had stopped moving on the page for a long moment. "Good news?" she said. "Encouraging news," he said, which from Cross was approximately the same thing. Carrie Sutton had been up and walking the hallway of the boarding house for 4 days, which May had reported to Clara with the specific brevity of someone who had been carrying a fear for 2 weeks and was only now allowing herself to set it down. She reported it in passing, in the middle of a supply tally, saying, "Carrie walked to the end of the hall and back twice this morning," and then moving directly to the next item on the list, and Clara had let her do that because May had earned the right to manage her own relief in her own way. It was on a Sunday, 11 days after the meeting, that the thing happened that Clara had been both preparing for and dreading. She had been at the cellar doing the morning inventory, a daily practice she had never delegated, because the cellar was the operational center of everything and she needed to know its actual state rather than a reported version of it. When she heard boots on the ramp behind her and turned to find Wyatt coming down with a particular expression she hadn't seen before. "We have a problem," he said. "Tell me." "The Winslow place." He stopped at the bottom of the ramp. "Hector went out there this morning. The family has been sick, all four of them, both parents and the two boys, for at least a week. They haven't sent word. They haven't asked for anything. Tom Winslow apparently decided they were going to manage on their own." "How bad?" Clara said. "The older boy is in recovery. The younger one—" Wyatt stopped. "He's 7. He's been sick for 9 days with no support and no adequate nutrition and no proper warmth because Tom was too sick to maintain the fire and too stubborn to ask for help." Clara was already moving toward the shelves. "What does Hector estimate for the situation?" "He says the boy is in worse shape than any case he's seen." Wyatt watched her pull supplies. "Clara, Hector doesn't get rattled. He was rattled." She had the recovery broth, the preparation for chest complications, the eucalyptus. She was working by the list in her head, the one she'd been carrying for weeks. "How long to get out there on the current roads?" "An hour and a half in the best conditions. The road past the ridge is drifted. Could be 2 hours." "I'm going with you," she said. "I thought you'd say that." "Don't argue with me about it." "I wasn't going to," he said. "I'm coming too." She loaded a pack with the specific supplies and the specific quantities that the scenario called for, the way her mother had taught her, not grabbing and hoping, but thinking clearly about what the situation needed and providing exactly that, no more, no less, because you never knew what would be the last trip, and you couldn't afford to leave something behind that couldn't be improvised from what was there. They drove out in the wagon with Hector, and the road past the ridge was as bad as Wyatt had said. Drifted in 2 places that required the men to clear a path with the shovels they'd brought, because Clara had asked Hector to bring them. And Hector, as always, had simply done it without needing the reason explained. The Winslow farmhouse was a small, tight structure that had been well built but was currently losing the argument with winter. The yard was drifted to the windowsills on the north side. No smoke coming from the chimney, which was the thing that made Clara's stomach drop when she saw it from the road. Tom Winslow met them at the door. He was sick, still clearly sick, fever-thin, holding himself upright with the specific careful posture of someone who knew that if he stopped being upright, he might not get up again. And his expression when he opened the door and saw them had in it, simultaneously, relief and shame and the remnant defiance of a man who had made a decision he was now standing in the consequences of. Wyatt said, "We're not here to discuss it, Tom. We're here to help." He said it evenly, without judgment, and walked in past him. The interior was cold, not dangerously cold, but cold enough that Clara could see her breath. She went directly to the room where Hector had found the boy. His name was Samuel. He was small for 7, or perhaps the sickness had made him seem smaller, and he was in a bed with every blanket in the house piled on him, which his mother had apparently managed before she was too sick to manage anything else. His mother was in the bed beside him, conscious but barely, in the unfocused state that Clara recognized as the late phase of the fever where the body has used up everything it had and is running on nothing. Clara worked without stopping for the next 4 hours. She rebuilt the fire first, heat before everything else. Heat before medicine and before nutrition, because a cold body cannot absorb either effectively. Hector had the fire going in 20 minutes while Clara assessed the boy. He was feverish still, but his fever had the quality of something that had passed its worst point, rather than something still climbing, which was the first thing she could use. She gave him the broth in small doses, as much as he would take without becoming sick from the effort of drinking. She gave him the preparation for immune support. She talked to him while she worked, not to distract him because he was too weak to be distracted, but because she had learned from her mother that the human voice was not nothing, that the brain in a weakened body was still listening for evidence that it was not alone. Wyatt handled Tom Winslow. She was aware of this happening in the background of the other room. Wyatt's voice, low and measured, and Tom's voice, which started with the rough quality of a man trying to maintain a position and gradually shifted into something else. She caught fragments, Tom saying he thought they could manage, Wyatt saying he knew, Tom saying he'd been wrong, Wyatt saying yes, and that was all, no elaboration, because some admissions don't need a speech around them, just an acknowledgement that they've been heard. Hector fed the livestock, who had not been adequately tended in days, and whose condition was the kind of evidence of a crisis that animals provide without meaning to. He did it without being asked, because Hector always did the thing that needed doing without being asked, and Clara thought, not for the first time, that this quality was rarer than it appeared, and more valuable than it was usually credited as being. The mother, Ruth Winslow, a woman of perhaps 35 who had the look of someone who had been strong for a long time and was currently discovering the floor of her reserves, took broth and the preparation and the warmth and began, slowly, over the course of the afternoon, to come back into her own eyes. By 3 o'clock she was conscious enough to speak. Her first words were about her children. "Samuel," she said. "Improving," Clara said. "He's going to need 2 weeks of careful recovery, but he's past the acute phase. He's going to be all right." But Ruth Winslow closed her eyes in the way that people close their eyes when something they've been holding is finally allowed to be put down. She didn't cry, she breathed, a long, slow breath that had in it the quality of a reckoning with how close things had come. "We should have asked," she said. "Yes," Clara said without cruelty. "You should have." "Tom was—" "I know what Tom was," Clara said, "and I know you know it too. We can talk about it when you're stronger. Right now, I need you to drink the rest of this." Ruth drank. They didn't get back to the ranch until well after dark, and the cold on the return drive was the kind that settled into the bones and stayed there. Clara sat beside Wyatt on the wagon seat with her hands inside her coat sleeves and her breath making small clouds in the dark air and the stars overhead with the hard, brittle brilliance they took on in deep cold. She was tired in a way that she had been avoiding noticing for several days. The kind of tired that doesn't come from any one thing, but from the accumulation of all the things. The early mornings and the late evenings, and the constant managing of detail, and the weight of knowing that the decisions she made had the specific gravity of being about people's lives, which did not get lighter simply because you were accustomed to making them. Wyatt said without looking at her, "You all right?" "Yes," she said. Then, "No, I don't know. I'm tired." "That's allowed," he said. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if Hector hadn't gone out there today," she said. "We had the Winslow place on the checklist. We've had it on the checklist for 2 weeks. Tom kept sending word through his neighbor that they were fine." "He lied," Wyatt said. "He didn't lie," she said. "He believed it. He's the kind of man who believes it right up until the moment it's demonstrably not true, and by then it's almost too late." She paused. "Samuel is 7 years old. If Hector had gone tomorrow instead of today—" "But he didn't," Wyatt said. "He went today." "I know." "That matters," he said. "That's the whole thing you've been building. A system where the Winslow boy gets help before it's too late. And it worked. Today it worked." She sat with this. The wagon moved through the dark and the cold, and the ranch lights became visible through the trees ahead, small and warm and exactly where they were supposed to be. "I was so angry at Tom," she said. "When I walked in and saw that fire was out, I was genuinely angry." "That's also allowed," Wyatt said. "I didn't show it." "I know you didn't." He was quiet for a moment. "You showed it to me. Just now. That's different." She looked at him. His profile in the dark, the set of his jaw, the lines of a face that had spent more time outdoors than in, and carried the record of it in the permanent way that weather marks a place. "When this is over," she said, referencing the earlier conversation on the porch without needing to explain it, "I'd like to hear about your wife." He didn't answer immediately. The wagon moved. The lights of the ranch got closer. "Her name was Anna," he said. "She would have liked you." He said it simply, the way he said most things, without decoration. She would have had opinions about the cellar, though. She always wanted things closer to the surface. "We could have done a compromise design," Clara said. 3 feet shallower on the north side. Wyatt made a sound that was fully a laugh, the first complete one she'd heard from him, unchecked, genuine. It lasted only a moment, but it was real, and it changed something in the air between them. 3 feet shallower, he said. I'll remember that. The ranch gate came up ahead, and Hector guided the wagon through it, and the lights of the house were close enough now that Clara could see the glow from the kitchen window, where Esther had almost certainly left something on the stove, because Esther always left something on the stove, because in 15 years she had learned that the people of this house came home hungry and cold and needed something that was ready. The wagon stopped. Hector climbed down and began unhitching without a word. Wyatt climbed down and offered his hand, and Clara took it. Not because she needed the help getting down, and he knew she didn't need it, but because the offering was a different kind of thing, and both of them knew that too. She let go of his hand and went toward the house, and the warmth of the kitchen hit her when she opened the door. The way warmth only hits you when you've been cold long enough to have forgotten what it felt like. And Esther turned from the stove and looked at her and said nothing, just pointed at the chair nearest the fire, and Clara sat down in it and let herself be warm. Outside, the temperature kept dropping, and the snow that had not stopped for 3 weeks showed no signs of stopping now. And somewhere in the valley, 67 families were managing the specific mathematics of survival. And tomorrow there would be more to do, and the day after that, and the day after that. But the system was holding. The cellar was not empty. The people who were sick had what they needed to fight their way back. And the people who weren't sick were not yet sick because of things that had been done in October that had seemed excessive, and were now the reason everyone was still here. Clara sat by the fire with her eyes open, looking at nothing in particular, and let the tiredness come up through her for a few minutes without fighting it, because Wyatt was right that it was allowed, and her mother had told her the same thing in different words. And a person who has been carrying something heavy is allowed to set it down for a moment, even if they're going to pick it back up. The stove clicked and settled. The fire cracked once, low. Esther set a bowl in front of her without comment, and Clara ate it. The fever broke across the valley the way most things break in winter. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in pieces, unevenly, one household at a time over the course of 4 days that felt simultaneously endless and too fast to trust. Cross came to the ranch on a Wednesday morning in the 5th week with his log under his arm and sat down at the kitchen table and opened it without preamble and said, 12 new recoveries since Sunday, no new critical cases since Monday. The case count is declining. He said it in the flat tone of a man reporting facts, but his pen was still, and he had not taken off his coat, and Clara understood that he needed a moment before he could put the next thing down on paper. "The Winslow boy?" she said. "Samuel is eating solid food," Cross said. "His mother walked to the end of the yard and back yesterday. Tom Winslow is—" He paused. "Tom Winslow is Tom Winslow, which means he's already talking about fence repairs he wants to make in the spring, which I take as a sign of full recovery." Clara set down her coffee. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window at an angle she hadn't seen in weeks. Lower, slower, the particular light of a winter that was still present, but had made some small concession to the fact that it would eventually end. "Peter Voss," she said, sitting up, talking. "He told me yesterday that the thaw signs he'd been watching before he got sick are still present, and that if he's reading them right, we have 3 to 4 weeks before the first break in the weather." Cross closed the log. "He's rarely wrong. 3 to 4 weeks. Clara did the math automatically, the way she'd been doing math for 5 weeks. Supplies against time, need against resource, what remained against what would still be required. The numbers were not comfortable. They were manageable. There was a difference, and she had learned to live precisely in the territory between those two things. "We can make it," she said. "We can make it," Cross agreed. Well, the remaining weeks had a quality that Clara found harder to navigate than the crisis itself had been, which was something she hadn't anticipated and probably should have. Crisis had a clarity to it. The problem was present. The response was demanded. The decisions, however difficult, had an urgency that made them simpler than they looked. What followed was harder, in the way that the day after a long effort is harder than the effort itself. The adrenaline gone, the structure still necessary but no longer driven by emergency, the people in it beginning to feel the weight of what they'd been carrying now that they had enough safety to feel it. She saw this in May, who had been running on the specific fuel of a woman with her granddaughter's life in the balance, and now, with Carrie safely recovering and walking to the end of the hall and back without assistance, had the look of someone who had surfaced from very deep water and was still figuring out which way was up. She saw it in Agnes Pryor, who had managed 2 households of sick people and a distribution operation for 5 weeks, and who appeared on the Tuesday after Cross's good news at the boarding house with her usual straight-backed efficiency, and then sat down abruptly at the coordination table and said to Clara, "I'm very tired." "I know," Clara said. "I just wanted to say it to someone," Agnes said. "I'm not asking for anything, I just needed to say it out loud." "You should say it out loud more often," Clara said. "You've been managing other people's crises so efficiently that I think you forgot you're allowed to have your own." Agnes looked at her. "Is that what you do?" Clara thought about sitting by the fire the night they came back from the Winslow place, the bowl Esther had put in front of her, the 20 minutes she'd allowed herself before she opened the notebook again. "I'm working on it," she said. She saw it most clearly in Wyatt. The week after Cross's report, Wyatt came in from the range one afternoon and found Clara in the cellar, doing what had become the ritual of the diminished inventory, cataloging what remained, measuring it against what had been used, writing the final accounting of a system that had not failed. He came down the ramp and looked at the shelves, which were sparse now in the way that shelves are sparse after they've served the purpose they were built for, and he stood there for a moment with his hands in his coat pockets. "We used nearly all of it," he said. "Nearly," Clara said. "Enough remains for another 2 weeks of reduced distribution, which is what Cross says we need to bridge to the thaw." He nodded. He was looking at the shelf where the preserved meats had been. 8 cattle worth of processing, 40 families worth of recovery nutrition, all of it gone into the valley and coming back to him now as the faces of people who were still alive because it had been there. "I keep doing the accounting," he said, "in my head. What this cost." "And?" Clara said. "And it's the best money I've ever spent," he said, "which is a strange thing to realize because I've spent money on things I thought mattered, land, cattle, infrastructure, things that last." He paused. "This doesn't leave anything you can put a hand on. The food is gone. The grain is gone. The cattle are gone." But Thomas Decker's sisters are alive," Clara said. "And Samuel Winslow. And Carrie Sutton and Gerald." "No, and Carrie Sutton." She stopped because she had almost said Gerald Hollis's name, who was not alive, and she was not going to paper over the real cost of what had happened with a tidy list of who had made it. 7 people died, she said. In 5 weeks of epidemic and hard winter, 7 people died in this valley. Cross says in a valley this size, with this severity of fever and this degree of isolation, the expected loss without the intervention we ran would have been 3 to 4 times that. 7 is still 7, Wyatt said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She said it without softening it, because Wyatt was not a man who needed things softened, and because she believed, more firmly the older she got, that pretending preventable deaths were acceptable because worse deaths were prevented was a transaction that cost something important in the making of it. 7 people were gone. The grief of their families was not a footnote to the survival of everyone else. Both things were true simultaneously, and the only honest place to stand was in the middle of that, without resolving it in either direction. Wyatt understood this. She could see it in the way he stood, not looking for comfort, not performing grief, just holding the true count and letting it be what it was. "What do we do with the cellar now?" he said, after a while. "Restock it," she said, "in the spring. Build the expansion I told Hector I was already planning." She almost smiled at this, the memory of Hector's laugh in the cold of late November, which felt like it belonged to a different year. "And I want to build one at May's boarding house, a smaller one, sized for town use. She'd manage it. She'd run it like a military operation," Wyatt said. "Yes," Clara said. "That's why I want her to do it." The thaw came on a Thursday afternoon, 26 days after Peter Voss's prediction, which put his accuracy at within 48 hours and confirmed what everyone in the valley already knew, which was that some knowledge couldn't be found in books and wasn't lesser for that. The temperature climbed 12 degrees in 6 hours. The icicles along the barn roof began to drip. The snow on the south-facing slope behind the house developed the wet, heavy quality that precedes serious melt. Clara was in the yard when it happened, carrying supplies from the cellar to the wagon for the final distribution run, and she stopped with a crate in her arms and stood still for a moment because the air had changed in a way that was physical, a softening. Like a door opened somewhere far away, and the cold began very slowly to move out of it. Hector beside her said, "There it is." "There it is," she said. He took the crate from her and loaded it without ceremony, and they finished loading the wagon and drove it into town for the last time with the specific feeling of last times, which is never as clean as you expect it to be because the ending of a hard thing is not the same as the restoration of the thing before it. The roads, when they appeared beneath the melt, were in the condition that roads are in after a hard winter, rutted, damaged, some sections washed or drifted in ways that would need repair before they were fully passable. Tom Winslow, who had been in Clara's thoughts since the Winslow farmhouse visit for reasons she had not fully articulated even to herself, organized a road crew the second week of the thaw. He did this without being asked and without making a production of it. He simply appeared on the main street of Silver Creek one morning with 3 other men and tools and began working on the worst section of the road between town and the outlying homesteads. Clara heard about this from May, who heard about it from Agnes, who had seen it from the window of the Hollis house where she was still helping with the children. "Tom Winslow's doing road work," May said, in the tone she used for things that surprised her but that she didn't want to appear to be surprised by. "Good," Clara said. "He's not a man who does things like that," May said. "He wasn't," Clara said. May looked at her over the coordination table with the expression of a woman who was revising an opinion she'd held for a long time and was deciding whether to say so out loud. She decided to say so out loud. "You've changed some people," she said, "in this valley." "People change themselves," Clara said. "The conditions just have to be right." "Don't do what James Decker told you not to do," May said, with the small, dry precision of a woman who forgot nothing. "He told you not to distribute the credit so thin nobody gets any, so don't." Clara looked at her. May was watching her with the directness of a woman who had been in this valley for 30 years and had the particular authority that came from that, not the authority of rank or wealth, but the authority of sustained presence, of having stayed when staying was hard, of knowing a place deeply enough to love and be frustrated by it simultaneously. "All right," Clara said. "I changed some people." "Yes," May said. "You did." The final accounting meeting happened on the first Saturday in March, when the roads were open enough that most of the valley's families could make it to town. May's boarding house wasn't large enough for the crowd that came, and the meeting moved to the open space beside the livery stable, which was not elegant but had the advantage of being the largest flat surface available. 40 families. The near-complete roster of Silver Creek's valley, standing in the mud and the thin March sunlight that felt warmer than it was because they had all been cold for so long. Cross presented the medical accounting. He did it with the precision Clara expected and with something else she hadn't quite expected, a directness about what had worked and what hadn't, including an acknowledgement that his initial resistance to Clara's methods had been, in his words, professionally narrow, which was as close to a public apology as she suspected he was capable of, and which she valued exactly for that reason. Clara presented the supply accounting, where the food had come from, where it had gone, what the costs had been, what had been lost, and what remained. She read the names of the 7 people who had died, Gerald Hollis, Thomas Decker, and 5 others, and she read them without rushing because they were owed the time it took to say their names. Then she talked about the next step. "What we built this winter worked," she said, "not because of any single decision or any single person, but because enough people, when it mattered, chose to act for the whole valley instead of only for themselves. That's not a small thing. It's also not permanent unless we make it permanent." She proposed the community emergency store, a building to be built cooperatively, maintained cooperatively, stocked at the beginning of each winter from community contributions, and managed by a rotating committee of 3 people. Not charity, not the wealthy giving to the poor. A shared infrastructure, like a well or a road, that belonged to everyone and therefore required everyone to maintain it. The conversation that followed was long and not always graceful. There were disagreements about governance, about contribution levels, about who would manage the accounting. Henry Garvey had concerns about liability. A man named Doris Pratt, who had been one of the two families who had not contributed at the Thursday meeting, said nothing for the first 40 minutes and then raised a practical question about access that was actually a reasonable question, and Clara answered it directly, without either punishing him for his earlier silence or rewarding him with excessive gratitude for finally speaking. The vote, when it came, was 38 in favor, 2 abstentions, not unanimous, but more than sufficient. After the meeting, people stayed. The way people stay after the thing they came for is done, because the gathering itself turns out to be the thing they needed. The simple fact of being in the same place, looking at each other's faces, verifying with their own eyes that the winter hadn't taken more than it had. Clara stood at the edge of the gathering with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and watched. The Decker family was talking to the Shu family. Margaret Decker and Liang Shu's daughter, an unlikely pair, bent together over something that made them both laugh, which was the sound Clara would remember most from that afternoon. Agnes Pryor and Tom Winslow were in conversation, which she noted because 10 weeks ago those two people had nothing particular to say to each other, and now they had the body language of people who had been through something together and knew it. May was talking to Cross, and May was gesturing with her coffee cup, and Cross was listening with the expression of a man who was disagreeing internally and choosing to wait. Wyatt appeared beside her the way he'd gotten into the habit of appearing, without announcement, without making an event of it. 38-2, he said. Better than I expected, she said. I expected 38, he said. I know this valley. She looked at him. He was watching the gathering with the expression she'd first noticed on the day they drove out to the Decker farm together. The particular quality of attention of a man who had closed himself off from this valley for years and was only now recognizing what he'd been standing outside of. You do know it, she said, better than you let yourself for a while. He didn't deny this. He stood with his coffee and looked at his neighbors and said, I want to talk to you about the spring. The spring, she said. The seed reserve, he said. I put in 30 bushels at the Thursday meeting. I have 20 left for planting. It's enough for my operation. What I want to know is whether there are families in this valley who went into this winter short on seed and are going to come out of it shorter. Clara thought. She had the census in her head, the full picture of 41 households that she'd built over 5 weeks of coordination. 3 families, she said, maybe 4. The Winslow place, because Tom's not going to have the same yield after this winter's losses. The Decker family, because... She stopped. Because they've had a hard year. I want to cover their seed costs, Wyatt said. Privately. Not as a community contribution. Not as charity with a committee. He paused. Just between us and them. They might resist, she said. James Decker won't resist, Wyatt said. Not from me. We understood each other in a particular way this winter. He looked at his coffee. And Thomas was 8 years old. Whatever I can do for James's family, I'm going to do. Clara looked at him for a long moment. The man who had told her in October that money and land were the only reliable things. The man who had jumped into a frozen pit to help her work because the work needed to go faster. The man who had ridden out alone in the dark to the Shu farm because he thought of them and didn't want them overlooked. All right, she said. I'll go with you when you talk to them. I was hoping you'd say that, he said. The afternoon light on the mud and the remaining snow had turned the particular gold of early March, thin and unreliable but genuinely warmer than it had been, and the crowd around them was slowly dispersing back toward wagons and horses and the roads that were passable again, back to their farms and houses and the business of beginning to repair what the winter had damaged. This is what survival actually looks like, Clara thought, not the dramatic moment of rescue, not the crisis peak when the decision gets made. It looks like this, the difficult, imperfect, arguing and voting aftermath. The 2 families who said no, the 38 who said yes, The road crew Tom Winslow organized without being asked because he needed to do something with the knowledge of how close it had come at his own farm. She had grown up watching her mother navigate the specific distance between what could be planned and what actually happened. And the lesson she'd taken from it was not optimism or pessimism, but something closer to what she'd tried to explain to Cross that first night at the doctor's office table. Preparation was not a guarantee. It was a bet you made against an uncertain future, with the best information you had and the most honest accounting of your own limits. Sometimes the bet paid off more than you'd expected. Sometimes you lost things you hadn't planned to lose. The value of the bet was not in the certainty of the outcome. The value was in the making of it, in the decision, repeated daily over months, to act as if what you built mattered, even before you had proof that it did. The proof, when it came, was never clean. 7 people were dead. 34 cases of illness in people who might have recovered faster under different conditions. A valley that would carry the memory of this winter in the specific way that communities carry the winters that almost broke them. Not as trauma exactly, but as a permanent alteration of something, a new layer added to the sense of what this place was and what its people were capable of. And alongside all of that, Carrie Sutton walking the length of the boarding house hall and back. Samuel Winslow eating solid food, a vote of 38-2 for a structure that had never existed before, and that would, if the people maintained it, mean that the next hard winter would be met differently than this one had been. Wyatt put his empty coffee cup on the edge of a post. "Ready?" he said. "For what?" "For whatever's next," he said. "I've learned that's usually the only relevant question." She looked at him. He was standing in March light with the particular ease of a man who had come to a decision about himself and was living inside it, rather than approaching it from the outside, and his face had the quality she'd been watching develop over 5 months. Not softer exactly, because this was not a man the world had been gentle to, and the face reflected that honestly. But more open, more present, more willing, in the specific way that she'd come to understand was the rarest thing in a person. Willing to be here, fully, with whatever being here cost. "Ready," she said. They walked together toward the wagon, through the thinning crowd and the mud and the cold March light, and Hector was already at the reins as always, and Drum the horse was standing with his usual constitutional indifference to weather and occasion. And the road back to the ranch was clear, and there was spring planting to think about, and a cellar to restock, and a community storehouse to build, and a conversation with James Decker to have. There was a great deal still to do. There always was. That was not a burden. Or it was a burden, but it was the kind that a person could carry if they had learned to put it down at the right moments and pick it up again with different hands. Claire climbed up to the wagon seat, and Wyatt climbed up beside her, and Hector clicked his tongue at Drum, and the wagon moved. Behind them, the last families of Silver Creek dispersed into the afternoon, carrying the winter home with them in all the ways it would be carried. In grief and in relief and in the quiet knowledge of what they had found out about themselves when the conditions were as bad as they could get. Most of them didn't know how to name that knowledge yet. Most of them wouldn't try. They would simply live differently from now on, in the small particular ways that people live differently when they have discovered the thing they're capable of and can no longer pretend otherwise. That, in the end, is the thing that neither the cellar, nor the cattle, nor the recovery broth had built. Those were the conditions. What the people of Silver Creek built, through 5 weeks of sickness and fear and disagreement and imperfect cooperation, was the knowledge of what they were when the worst came. You can store food against a hard winter. You cannot store that kind of knowledge. You can only earn it, the hard way, by living through the thing that produces it. And then you carry it forward into the springs that follow, into the ordinary, unremarkable days that come after the crisis and seem lesser only if you forget what they cost. They are not lesser. They are the point.